Welcome everyone to the Periodic Table of History. This is where we study history in 4 dimensions. This is our time machine, and as you all know from the other videos, we've been studying through the Bible, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, down into Greek history, Italian history, British history, and now we're down here almost in current history. Today we're going to use the time machine and study the era from about Edward I down into Queen Anne, the time of Queen Anne. And we're going to answer the question, how did Great Britain become Great Britain? So let's get our equilibrium with regard to geography. We're going to zoom in here to the United Kingdom of present day. Let's also zoom into our 4th dimension down here, the time axis. We're going to start off talking about Edward I Longshanks, and he was named that because of his long legs. In 1276, there was a Welsh rebellion, and that triggered the Normans to invade into Wales in 1277. In 1284, Edward I of England was finally able to conquer Wales. That led to the unification of this southern area of England, what was being called England at the time after the Angles. That unification of England caused the Scots to have a greater threat. Edward I did survive an assassination attempt. An assassin came into his bedchamber and stabbed him with a poisoned dagger. That's what the picture is right here. Eleanor of Castile was said to have attended Edward I, and he did survive this assassination attempt. One of the more sinister events of Edward's reign was the expulsion of the Jews from England. That happened in 1290. The Protestants were forbidden to charge interest, but the Jews actually could charge interest to someone who was not a Jew. The result of this is the nobility took interest loans from the Jews, but eventually didn't want to pay the interest. The nobility came up with charges which may have been false, and one of those charges was that they may have been biting off little pieces of gold from the gold coins, and that's an act called clipping. So the Jews were charged with this, charged with usury, and the nobility in turn didn't have to pay the interest. Shakespeare has a play on this very subject. It's called The History of the Merchant of Venice. If you're interested in this topic, this play is a good one to watch so you can see the thought process of the time, and of course Shakespeare there again capturing the human condition, in this case power and money and the control of people. Well, the Scots were very wary of Edward I and his growing power. Things were not going so well in Scotland. We can look at this little inflection point right here at about this same time. Margaret of Norway, 1286 to 1290. She died prematurely, and then it was difficult for the Scottish to give respect to any one king, and at the same time, Edward Longshanks was trying to consolidate Scotland into his own kingdom. There is a rebellion called Stirling Bridge that happens in 1297, and it's a terrible defeat of the British, whereby there was a bridge. The armies of England in the south had to use this bridge to get north up to the armies of Scotland. The armies of Scotland had set that place up because anywhere you would go after you get across the bridge is marshy and very hard to keep your ground in. And so the Scots had the advantage. If you went through the river, you would drown because of the heavy armor that you had on. And so Scotland had the victory at this 1297 battle. That keeps England from conquering Scotland at this point in time. And then there's a guerrilla war launched by William Wallace. And we all know him from the movie called Braveheart. Documents called the Pipe Rolls of Westminster Abbey confirmed that William Wallace was killed at the year 1305. Robert the Bruce counterattacked Edward's army and was able to stave off invasion, so Scotland remains independent here at about 1306. If we zoom out, we can see that the Scottish line keeps on going for a ways. The land of England is pretty flat, but when you get up into Scotland, it's a lot more mountainous, so it just gets to be a lot harder to conquer this area. We'll next travel down here to this white arrow. Edward III marries the French princess Philippa. The marriage was seen as an attempt to combine the French and English empires together, but the English didn't think of it that way. So the French demanded taxes from the English. The English refused to pay, so the French launched their navy against England. It should have been a good, easy victory for France, except there was a decisive battle against them, and the English got the victory. Well, with the victory, they also got the French ships. So now the French lost their navy. England was able to build up their navy with all the English, Anglo-Saxon, and Norse technology, and now they had the French navy as all the ships they had just taken over from the French at their disposal. This is a point in history where naval power moves increasingly toward the English. This is also the start of the 100 Years' War. It goes from 1337 to 1453, so it's a little longer than 100 years, but still called that. Now, we've heard of the Magna Carta before, where the king was supposed to be subject to the law of the land. Well, one invention during this 100 Years' War and during Edward III was the advent of the House of Commons, and that was the house that was supposed to represent the common people. It gave the people just a little bit of power that they didn't have before, so the government could address the needs of the people instead of being completely self-serving. So this is a great victory for the people, actually, the peasants and the people that do the work in the kingdom. A lot of battles that are happening between England and France, sometimes England winning, sometimes losing. And France did actually win out in this because they didn't have to resupply their army by going across any ocean. They could just directly resupply the army. England didn't have that advantage. During this 100 Years' War, the English start to get very tactical in their use of the longbow. Now the French then redesigned their armor so they can withstand the arrows of the longbow. Now another thing that happens in 1348 is the Black Death. It's called Yersinia pestis, as shown in the microscope slide. Estimates of how many people this killed as a function of total population is 40 to 60%. Very, very high population death. If we compare that to the current coronavirus of 2020, at the end of March, about 3 million people have died of the coronavirus worldwide, but the population is 7.8 billion people. So if you do the math on that, change it to a percentage, you find out that 2020 coronavirus death a year after it happened accounts for 0.04% of all world deaths. Contrast that to 40% deaths caused by the Black Death. And remember, that Black Death number is 40 to 60%, so if it was even 50%, you're talking about 1 out of every 2 people dying. So many people dying that there weren't enough people to carry the bodies out. That's how bad this time was. The Black Death brings on an interesting phenomena. What it is because of the depopulation, now there are fewer people, but the same amount of land. So there's a vacuum in the price of labor, which causes the price of labor to go up. Or what that ends up doing is giving more value to the person who works the field. Many local laws were starting to be changed in such a way that the peasants actually could gain some ground. They could double their fields, they could get more of their profit, they could feed their families better, and they could also sell more to other people. And we can think of this as an amazing byproduct of all the events that are unfolding, but the nobility also looked at this and didn't like it. They didn't like the idea of the peasants having more money and more power. So they decided, since the peasants were making more money, they would put greater taxes onto the people. And they would tax people who are non-virgins. And that's an interesting way to separate people. Then they allowed their tax collectors to do tests on people to see if they're virgins or not. and that led to just mass rebellion, hysteria, and the 1381 peasant revolt. So the tax collectors were allowed to sexually assault women. Everybody went into an uproar over this, and they went directly to the tax collectors' records so they can find out who was responsible for this. And once that was found out, they got a listing of the people that were responsible. They just went far and wide, cutting people, chopping their heads off. So it was similar to the French Revolution. It was just this temporary revolt against the nobility who thought they had the audacity to make slaves out of the people and give this egregious power to tax collectors. So Thomas the Baker is one of the people that's heavily involved in this. And from a few different angles, a few different rebel leaders go towards London and put London in flames. We can wonder when the nobility will judge righteously. The times of the nobility are few and far between of judging righteously. I think it's what most of the people in the world want, and Solomon even talked about this, that the throne could be established forever if the nobility would judge righteously. But oftentimes that just isn't the case. I mean, we think of our modern times with, say, Hunter Biden, and it's the same exact thing. There seems to be a system of rules for the elite and another system of rules for the peasants, even though all of our attempts have tried to stamp this out, even in American culture. But righteousness always has to be upheld by righteous people, and if the people don't want that, then it just falls to the wayside, as we always see. In Proverbs 28, "For the transgressions of a land, many are the princes thereof, but by a man of understanding and knowledge, the state thereof shall be prolonged." Well, we can zoom out now and zoom down to Henry VIII. I'm sure everybody's heard about him. His major contribution is because of his catastrophe with his wives. He severs ties with the Catholic Church and sets up the Anglican Church. It's the same form, except it's localized in England instead of being localized into Rome. His life and his palace at Hampton Court is interesting in its own right. There's videos that talk about Henry VIII in every single aspect, that go one by one through all his wives, etc., etc., his birth, his youth, his life, his death. The world has lots of information on this king. And we can go down just a little bit and we start to get into the time of Elizabeth and also Mary, Queen of Scots. So we'll zoom over here to Mary, Queen of Scots, 1542 to 1567. This ends up being quite the conundrum for England and Scotland. A church war between Protestantism and Catholicism comes to the surface. Strangely enough, England has Mary, Queen of Scots educated in France. So in her upbringing, she is Mary, Queen of Scots is pro-Catholic and pro-French. Elizabeth happens to side with the Protestants. So that puts England and Scotland at odds with each other again, and it causes Scotland itself to be the centerpiece for Catholic strategy of trying to overpower England. The Catholic Church of Rome puts all of their eggs in the basket of Mary, Queen of Scots as the person that can overthrow England. There's a lot of treachery that's associated with Mary, Queen of Scots. In 1570, the Earl of Moray was the first person assassinated by a firearm in the world. And this assassination was connected to Mary, Queen of Scots. One of the scandals of Mary, Queen of Scots may have been her role in the murder of her husband, Lord Darnley. There were scandals upon scandals, and definitely check out Mary, Queen of Scots. Her biography is worth the read. John Knox has just been educated in Protestant Calvinism, and he brings that Calvinism to Scotland. He starts the Presbyterian Church, and he is another immense personality that's worth studying. After Mary Queen of Scots was imprisoned, John Knox openly called for the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, and that did happen in 1587. Protestant Queen Elizabeth had Catholic Mary Queen of Scots executed in 1587. Now, the Catholic Church was backing up Mary Queen of Scots intensely, so when this execution took place, they had to go to Plan B, and Plan B was war using the Spanish Armada. So the Spanish Armada was one of the biggest naval forces in the world. It was designed to take armies through the Mediterranean and Africa and then trade and also land troops wherever it could. So each one of the galleons of the Spanish Armada was quite large and quite capable of holding on to an army. They built them large and they built them so they would be ocean-worthy. Contrast that with the Norse type kind of ships and the technologies of the Angles and the Saxons that are used to riding around all the seas and going into small rivers. So now you have really fast English ships versus huge galleons. Those huge galleons thought they would trap the British ships between England and France, but because of the maneuverability of the English ships got around the Spanish Armada. The English were able to use the wind towards their own favor. And then when you get quite a few, like maybe 130 Spanish galleons in this very small area, they start getting compressed into this area around Dover. There were many battles that lasted many days that pushed the Spanish galleons farther and farther to the east, making them less and less maneuverable. At first, the British didn't do very well in sinking any of the Spanish ships, but as times went on and risks got higher, more and more Spanish ships went down. As they got closer into this channel, they also got shoved up onto barges, immobilizing some of the ships, rendering them useless. Now, Spain had to take their armada, which now was limping away, lots of holes in their ships, and limp them all the way around Scotland, try to get them back around Ireland. That ended up thwarting their plan to land an army right here on the shore of England and have a base to invade. So these galleons that had lots of army soldiers in them couldn't use any of the army soldiers against England. They were just all trapped into this galleon, which was useless in this area. So though the Spanish had twice as many ships as the English were the victor that day. And it's another anomaly which actually changed the naval power in favor of the English once again. Because we can see even through this, you have the technology of the Norse from the last video, adding to the Anglo-Saxons the British, which were a naval force to start off with in the first place, then the defeat of the French Navy, and now the defeat of the Spanish Navy. So the Roman Catholic Church failed to install its preferred Mary Queen of Scots and use that as a Catholic base to overthrow England. Then it failed at this attempt for Spain itself to send its whole naval fleet to destroy England. So now an interesting turn happens, and that is the son of Mary Queen of Scots is King James. So James is the son of Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, but then he is brought up as a Protestant. He does a decent job of balancing all the aspects of the kingdom, but the Catholics of Rome are still in this same mindset to overthrow England, so they come up with the Gunpowder Plot. So in 1605, the Catholics made another attempt to destroy the Protestant movement, and that was by blowing up King James and the Parliament using gunpowder. When I read through history, I am constantly staggered at people. People are so extraordinarily evil. It doesn't matter where they come from, etc. There's just nothing new under the sun. You can read John 11, And it says, "Then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees a council and said, What do we? For this man doth many miracles." And then in verse 49, "And one of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, Ye know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and the whole nation perish not." Whenever religions lose sight of the true religion to help the widow and the orphan, then it just becomes a skeleton power system. Even if its ideology is good, it still falls back into this corruption of mankind. So I am constantly staggered at the study of history. The 1605 Gunpowder Plot fails, King James is not assassinated, and the Protestant nation of England gains more traction still. After all the misery of all this time, the English people break off into two camps. One of them becomes the Puritans that think they can purify England with a revival, and the other ones are called separatists. So the separatists move out to a new land. Now let's zoom into the Americas over here on the right. The separatists decide there's nothing they can do to change things in England. They have to compete with the Anglican Church, which is the Catholic Church based in England, or they have to compete with the Roman Catholic Church. Either way, they decide it's much more worth their while to go to this little tiny settlement, risking their lives to start completely anew. Such were the events during the time of King James. Queen Elizabeth was walking with Sir Walter Raleigh, who had brought back some tobacco from his explorations. Sir Walter Raleigh was smoking his cigars. Elizabeth challenged him, telling him that he doesn't know the weight of what he smokes. So Sir Walter Raleigh takes her up on her challenge and says, "Well, you'll have to pay me gold if I can tell you what I'm smoking." The bet is made, and Sir Walter Raleigh weighs his cigar. Then he smokes most of the cigar, puts the cigar back on the scale, does a simple subtraction. This is known as a loss on ignition test in chemistry, and gives Queen Elizabeth the result. So Elizabeth is amazed at Sir Walter Raleigh's candidness, and she says, "I have seen many men turn their gold into smoke." But this was the first time she had seen smoke turned into gold. Well, King James never appreciated that smoke or that tobacco, and moved to make tobacco illegal in England, and that widely failed. Tobacco was found in the New World to grow quite well. And though King James failed in his attempt to make tobacco illegal, he did succeed in creating the King James Bible. It's only called the authorized version of the Bible because it was authorized by the very King of England. So this is known as the 1611 King James Version of the Bible. It can't be understated how this revolutionized the world. Well, governmental changes were quite hard during this time. You can see here that Charles I was executed, and we can move down into the life of Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell is a pivotal figure to the thinking of England, so he's definitely well worth studying. King Charles was trying to renege on this idea that the king should be under the law, and because of the Parliament having been established, there had to be lines drawn up on who had what power. How much power does the monarch have versus how much power does the Parliament have? So the king wanted complete autonomy and authority. The parliamentarians didn't think this was going to work very well. So that led to a civil war in England. You can look at the Battle of Naseby in 1645 to check out this battle. That's Nasby. The parliamentarians won out, and more power was given to the parliament, less power given to the monarchy. In 1657, Oliver Cromwell permitted Jews to return to England, and Cromwell oversaw the overhaul of the laws of England. Now, if we go just a few short years later, 1665, we have the plague. Now this plague wasn't as bad as the Black Plague, but it still killed off 25% of the population. And 25% is just horrifying, especially just compare that to the coronavirus of 2020 that killed 0.04% of the population. So every family will have been affected by this. That was 1665, and then there was a great fire in 1666. So Samuel Pepys writes about this. He was kind of a sick guy, but he had a diary, and he kept detailed records about the plague and also the fire. There was a building code changed here. Britain was tired of everyone building out of wood, and so you see a lot of stone buildings after 1666. Let's zoom out one more time, and then we'll zoom in to Queen Anne. This is when the Kingdom of England turns into the Kingdom of Great Britain. This was done by the addition of Scotland, but it was quite a feat to accomplish. There was a lot of back and forth between England and Scotland. We can see that the line of Scotland ends right here with Scotland being ruled by Britain after 1707, and you can see Queen Anne right here in 1702. There was a lot of squabbling on which way to combine Scotland with England or England with Scotland. And depending on how you did it, you would make one group of people happy or another group of people angry. So Queen Anne comes up with this novel system to try to unite Scotland and England. Instead of just having a House of Commons, and it represents supposedly the common people, and populating that with your people, and then the common people end up not getting representation, why don't you populate that with two different parties? So now the people can vote on the two different parties instead of a one-party state that's supposedly supposed to represent the common people. So the two parties are the Tories that represent the Anglican Church, and the second party is the Whig Party that represents the Protestant side of the church. And remember, Scotland is a little bit more Protestant, and of course, Anglican would go alongside with the Church of England, which is going to be the state church. So now by having the two-party system, Scotland can feel represented by sending people that will represent Protestant values. So now they can combine the two countries together. Queen Anne oversaw a natural disaster in 1703, and it's interesting to see that she declared a fast to pardon the sins of the country. So this gives you a little bit of insight into her as a person. In 1706, the Act of Unification was put up to discussion, and in 1707, it was voted on and ratified. So England and Scotland was united, and the whole land was renamed Great Britain. That's where that comes from. Well, friends, this is an amazing period of time. I think the best way to learn about this in detail is getting a hold of some of the biographies of these people. Remember, we talked about Edward I, also Edward III, William Wallace, and just remember that the way Hollywood is, you can't just get one take on William Wallace and think you have the picture. It's good to get 3 takes of any biography just before you start to be able to unveil all the political bias of the person that's writing. If you have the time, be sure to check out The History of the Merchant of Venice, the play written by Shakespeare. And there's so many events in here. The Black Death, the Peasant Revolt, they're just fascinating. Henry VIII, so much is on him. Mary, Queen of Scots. I mean, this is just an intensely historical and literary time. We have a lot of writing on these people and on this time. John Knox, if you're interested in the church, I mean, he's one of the church fathers in Scotland, and Scotland is the way it is today because of John Knox. Elizabeth, James, Cromwell, and Queen Anne, they're all spectacular figures in history. And when you get into history, you find out these people aren't too much different than the people we see today. Have fun on your quest for truth, And remember that in 2 days, tomorrow will be yesterday. So make the most of every single day. And I'll see you in the next video. Have a great week.